Kati Preston will speak for approximately 45 minutes, and then we'll have about 20 to 25 minutes at the end of the talk for Q&A. We have microphones set up in the aisle. We just respectfully request that you wait until the end of her talk to ask questions. And once the program concludes, she has written a memoir called Hidden, which is targeted at middle school students, and she has them up on stage available. So if you're interested in purchasing a copy, you can come up on stage at the end of the evening and meet Kati yourself. So now I'd like to turn it over to Rabbi Eliza J with Temple Shir Tikva in Wayland, who will offer a few opening remarks.
It is a true privilege to be here. 82 years ago today, on December 11th, 1941, Nazi Germany declared war on the United States. The declaration of war was announced at a German Reichstag meeting in a speech by Hitler that was also broadcast on the radio. Following the meeting, in an entry in his diary, Nazi leader Joseph Goebbels reflected on Hitler's unequivocal calls for the destruction of the Jews. Regarding the Jewish question, he wrote, "The Fuhrer has decided to make a clean sweep." He prophesied to the Jews that if they yet again brought about a world war, they would experience their own annihilation. That was not just a phrase. The world war is here. The annihilation of the Jews must be the necessary consequence. Anyone who denies Hitler's final solution for the Jews of Europe need only to look at the words and writing of the Nazis themselves. Over and over again, their records confirm their mission to eradicate the Jewish people and to preserve only Jewish personal and ritual items, ultimately to be housed in a museum for extinct peoples. The events of December 11th, 1941 represented a turning point in the Nazi attitude toward the Jewish people. It marked a shift from propaganda, intimidation, and attacks to outright extermination, a move from words to deeds. We know today what 6 million Jews and 3 million others of that time could never have predicted. We are able to see in retrospect the foreboding signs and warnings of the unimaginable outcome, the destruction of 2/3 of Europe's Jews by the war's end through a planned and implemented genocide that today we know of as the Holocaust, or Shoah in Hebrew. The generations since then, ours included, have spent the past 8 decades rebuilding and repairing. We have fortified Jewish living both here in the US and in the state of Israel, and we have witnessed fledgling Jewish communities throughout the world, and even a blossoming of Jews and Judaism once again in Europe. But perhaps the most important role that we, the generations after the Holocaust, have had is that of being listeners. In committing to the renewal and rejuvenation of Jewish life after what Elie Wiesel called the kingdom of night, we have come to understand that central to our future is the education of adults and children through stories of the past, stories of those who survived, stories of those who perished. It is this testimony, your testimony, that stands as our collective legacy for tomorrow. Your memories become our memories. Your words, our words. Kati Preston needs no introduction. Her story is unique. Her memories give voice and life to the 28 members of her family, including her father, who perished at the hands of the Nazis. Kati not only lived to tell her story, but she has survived to transmit hope, optimism, resilience, and strength to her children and grandchildren and to all of us. Kati's life story shines as a light in the darkness. As we celebrate Hanukkah this week, our festival of lights, we are keenly aware that survivors like Kati now rely on us, the generations after hers, to keep her light and life brightly glowing. It is up to us now to ensure that your story continues on. Thank you.
Hello? It works. Great. Hi, my name is Kati Preston, and I'm a Holocaust survivor. I was never in a camp. I was a hidden child because I was only 5 years old when my persecution happened, and my life was saved by a very brave woman, which I will tell you in a minute. But the reason that I'm speaking is because there are so few of us left alive. I used to go to a school with 4 other survivors. We used to go every year. Last year I was the only one left. People are dying, and unfortunately, as more people die, I've become terribly popular. I'm the only one left. So I get invited a lot nowadays. But basically, the reason I speak is because there are still people who deny that it even happened. I mean, the best documented genocide in the history of the world is denied by people. And I want to make sure that people remember, all I do is I go to schools, mainly to schools, but I go anywhere where people will listen to me. The only place I don't like to go is Monday mornings in colleges because they're all hungover. But I speak in churches, I speak in museums, I will speak anywhere where people want to listen. But my favorite group is this generation of kids in school today. For some reason, this generation is better than the generation before. Somehow the generation before were more interested in fame and success. This generation worries about the environment. They don't want to live in their parents' basement when they're 55. They're a different animal. They're much more human. They're much more aware of life. They care about each other. They don't care if somebody's blue, green, yellow, straight, gay. The prejudices have gone. And I just love this generation. I'm very, very optimistic, believe it or not. I know it's funny, I'm coming here to talk about the tragedy, and I'm talking about optimism. Excuse me 1 second. Somebody once asked me what's in the bottle. Well, it's not vodka. It's water. Anyhow, the thing is that, you know, I think it's very important to leave real stories, real memories, because after all, humans live through history, and that's the very thing that people want to eradicate. I keep telling kids, don't let them eradicate your history. History is not pretty. History is sad, history is tragic, but if you don't know your history, you can so easily repeat it. And after all, we are who our ancestors were. We are a long line of people. We are a result of all those histories. And I come from a small town in a place called Transylvania. You know where the vampires come from? Anyway, there's no vampires, but the legend still lives. They still hang garlic on all the windows for some reason. And it was a small town, a very happy little town. It had about 100,000 people. And it was quite cultured. At the time that I was being persecuted, it was under the Hungarians. And the town had a big Jewish community, a Romanian community, a Hungarian community, and Roma people whom they call gypsies. And everybody seemed to get along because when there's prosperity, people don't hate each other as much. And life was good. It was quite a cultured little town. We even had an opera house. We had lots of theaters. And there was a very vibrant life there. And my parents, for those days, were very unusual. My mother was a Catholic and my father was a Jew. And when they married, they were both disowned by both families. It was a big scandal. Wasn't done. People didn't intermarry. And my parents were very happy together. My mother converted to Judaism to try and please my father's large Jewish family. But I don't remember them doing very much in terms of religion at home. I mean, my mother would pray on a Friday night. She had a scarf and she would bend over a candle and mutter things in a foreign tongue. And I thought she was doing magic. I wasn't quite sure what she was doing. But that's about the only Jewish religious thing that I remember. And my parents for those days were very well off. My mother was a dressmaker. You see, people didn't buy dresses in a shop. Everybody bought a piece of cloth and would go to a dressmaker to have it manufactured. And my mother had 40 girls working for her. It was a big business. People were coming far and wide to have dresses made. Especially, as I was telling our rabbi here, there were lots of religious communities around our town. The women would come to my mother to have dresses made with special sleeves that went over the hands because they had to cover their hands. And they were very beautiful, elegant ladies, but they were very, very covered. And my mother had all these girls working for her, so she was constantly busy. My father, who was really my parent more than my mother, had a wholesale fish business. There was a river that went through town, and he had great big crates of carp swimming in the river, and he would wholesale them to the local fish places. And we always had a carp swimming in our bath, always. We ate a lot of them, and I remember as a little girl, I was 4 and a half, I would go and talk to this carp, and I said, I'm so sorry we're going to eat you, but you're going to taste so good. And yes, we did eat a lot of carp, and they did taste very good. And I had an absolutely golden childhood. It was so wonderful. I was an only child of 2 parents who by this time were considered elderly. My mother was 30 and my father was 40 when I was born. So basically, you know, they were mature parents. And they lavished everything on me. I mean, there was not a toy or a dress or anything that I wanted that I didn't have. I had a room like a princess. I remember having to climb up onto my bed. There were so many feather mattresses that I had to have a little ladder to get to the top. You know, like the Princess and the Pea. I would be way up on top. And I would sit in this beautiful bed with all the lace hangings and toys everywhere. I really thought I was the center of the universe. I was like a little princess. I was a very, very spoiled, very happy little girl. And my parents didn't want to deprive me of Christmas either, because it was such an event that all the kids enjoyed. And I was allowed to have a Christmas tree every year. And we had this very tall ceiling, and there was a big tall tree with little candles on it. And every Christmas we had a fire. Of course, you light a candle on a fir tree, whoosh! We had buckets of water next to it, and they were throwing the water on the burning tree. And I remember that wonderful smell of burning Christmas. I remember those smells so vividly. And I used to love Christmas, not just because of the excitement of the fire, but the presents and everything else. And one of the maids decided to take me to the local church to show me the nativity scene. And I stole baby Jesus. I stuck him under my coat and I went home. He didn't have any clothes. I wanted to take him home and get him some clothes. It was cold. So my mother takes off my coat and she says, oh my God, they're going to say the Jews are stealing Jesus. I get back there at once and apologize to the priest. And I was dragged back, and I remember going to see this gentleman, the priest. He must have been very tall, because I started looking up, And I kept looking and looking and looking, and he was up there somewhere. Had a nose like a toucan. I've never seen a nose like that. Big bony finger, he waved it in my face, said, "You're going to hell for stealing Jesus. It's enough to put you off religion forever." I never wanted to go near a church ever. I was terrified. But you know, to this very day, every time I go past one of those displays, I'm so tempted. But you know, at this point, my parents decided that they had an out-of-control 4.5-year-old and something had to be done. And they got me a governess. Now, a governess was supposed to be somebody who helps you educate your child, teach them manners, and also a bit of schooling. My governess was, I think she was just a professional bully. She was terrible. She was a horrible woman. She came from Austria. She had a bun on her head, and she had, I don't think she had any lips. She had more like a slash on her mouth. She never smiled. She was always disapproving of everything. She was very disapproving. I had to have hard-boiled eggs under my armpits at the table so I wouldn't flap my wings as she called it. And she put a ruler behind me on the dining room chair with one string around my neck and one around my waist for posture. Mind you, it worked. Look at my posture now. 84, I'm so straight. She would. In all fairness, she did teach me to read, write, and speak German in less than 6 months, which was a big deal for a small child. But it came at a terrible cost. And I would complain to my father, saying, "I don't like Fräulein," which means Miss in German. Fräulein is mean, and he would say, "No, my dear, you have to listen to Fräulein. If you want to be a lady, you have to have a proper education, and Fräulein knows best." And Fräulein was very, very strict, and Fräulein wouldn't let me play with the children in the street anymore. And Fräulein was an absolutely, yeah, she was. She was terrible. And my daddy was my hero. I adored my father because he was very sort of cheerful and happy. Today I would probably be a bit ashamed of him because he would burst into the room singing opera at the top of his voice. And I thought this was wonderful. And I can imagine how embarrassed I would have been as a teenager if he had done that. But anyway, he was my hero, and he was always nice to me. In those days, children weren't spoken to like today. Today, children are considered part of the family and part of the decision-making. In those days, children were told, go here, go there, do this, do that. You weren't consulted. My father always explained things to me, and he even taught me all the constellations. I still know every constellation in Hungarian. And he always had a little present for me in his pocket whenever he came back, whether it was a marble or a ribbon or a flower. There was always something in his pocket. I used to be so excited to look in his pockets when he came home. And Fräulein let me play with one little boy who lived up the road because his parents were rich and she was a snob. And he had beautiful blonde curly hair and big blue eyes, and we used to have a game. I used to chase him in front of the opera house, which had a round driveway. And every time I caught him, I kissed him, and I learned to run really fast because he was very cute. And I loved this little boy, and he hated getting kissed. He kept wiping his little face. And this was my only friend that I was allowed to play with because Fräulein disapproved of everybody else. And by this time, our large Jewish family forgave my parents, and they started to come to dinner. And there would be a long table. There were a total of 18 of us, and we all sat at a long table, almost as long as this stage. And you know how these family dinners are. That one isn't talking to this one because he forgot the birthday, and you know how it is. But I was the youngest, and everybody was spoiling me. And my parents were making me stand up and recite things in German, and everybody would go ooh and ah, pat me on the head and tell me how beautiful I am and how clever I am. And I was basking in all this love, all these wonderful people who all loved me. And you know, I'm the only one who's alive, but everybody else was killed. I'm the only one who survived. And you know, then things started to change. Often kids ask me, how come Jews agreed to go to concentration camp? It wasn't like that. It wasn't a sudden thing, you're going to concentration camp. It was a gradual erosion of all our liberties. They took away our rights. First, Jews were no longer allowed to go to college. Then Jews were no longer allowed to go to high school. Then Jews were only allowed to go to Jewish school. Jews were no longer allowed to teach in a school. Jewish lawyers could no longer practice. Jewish doctors could no longer treat non-Jews, only Jews. Anybody who was in any kind of municipal job lost their job if they were a Jew. My first inkling of anti-Semitism was the fact that I was no longer allowed to sit on my favorite bench in the park because that wasn't a Jew bench. Jews had a special bench that said Jew on it with a yellow stripe, and that's the only bench we were allowed to sit on. We were completely discriminated against. And the Hungarian authorities were very sneaky because they told all the Jews to come to the police station and register so they could protect us. And everybody went and duly registered, so they knew where everybody lived, how many Jews in each house, who lived where, how many rooms they had, how many people in each family. They had everybody written up. And at this point, my parents decided to send me to a Jewish kindergarten a couple of mornings a week so that I would know something about my heritage. I don't remember much about it. I just remember singing little songs in Hebrew, and I was told that I'm a Jew, and I was trying to figure out what that meant because I kept looking at myself and I didn't look any different to the other kids in the town, and I thought, well, how does she know I'm a Jew? You know, what does it mean? It was very difficult to understand that I'm different from other people. And the only joy I had in that school is a little blonde boy was there, so I could carry on tormenting him. But that was about the sum total of my so-called Jewish education. And then a new law came that no women under the age of 45 were allowed to work for a Jewish home. And a lot of the girls who worked for my mother were gone, and to my joy, Fräulein, oh, she was gone. I didn't wash my hands for 3 weeks. That woman was a hand-washing maniac. You know, if you think you washed your hands a lot during COVID, nothing compared to what she did. She made me wash my hands every 2 minutes. It's a wonder I have any hands left, but when she left, I felt so liberated. I was so happy. And then my mother came to see me and she said, I have a present for you. And she brought this beautiful yellow star made of gold material and she sewed it onto my coat. And she said, we're going to go and get some pastries. And I'm walking next to her, you know, skipping next to her on the street, holding her hand. And a man comes opposite and he stops and he looks at me. And I look at him, sort of expecting a nice compliment about my beautiful star. And he spits in my face, and the spit runs down my cheek onto my star. And I look up at my mother and I said, he hates stars. Not thinking it's me he hated. And my mother, who normally is a very feisty woman, she takes me by the hand, she shushes me, and she says, we're going home, we're going home. Shh, I'll tell you when we get home, I'll tell you when we get home. And I said, but no, she says, I'll explain to you. And I'm crying, and I said, I want my daddy, I don't like this. Mom, why don't you say something to the man? And she takes me home, and she says, no, my dear, you don't understand. It's not the star, it's you he hates, because you're a Jew. So I say, well, if I didn't have this, would he know I'm a Jew? And she says, no, he wouldn't. I said, so why don't we take it off? She says, no, you can't. It's the law. You have to have it. I, even as a small child, had to be marked with a star. My mother, although she converted to Judaism, was not considered a Jew because the Hungarians only considered you Jewish by blood. Even if you had a great-grandparent who was a Jew, you were tainted, and you were supposed to be on that list. So my mother was pretty much exempt. She didn't have to have the yellow star. But for instance, if a Jew was walking down the sidewalk and there was only space for one person, and non-Jew came opposite, the Jew had to step off into the gutter. We were not allowed to even share the sidewalk with a non-Jew. We were no longer allowed to go to the cinema, no longer allowed to go to the theater, to a coffee house. We were no longer allowed to interact with people. And more laws started changing. And I remember some of these dinners, the people were talking about, well, maybe we should leave. And some other people in the family said, no, we're Hungarians. We were so proud of being Hungarians. We were like, you are Americans. You don't consider yourself Catholic or Jewish. You consider yourself American. And we considered ourselves Hungarians. And we said, well, no one's going to hurt us. After all, we're Hungarians. We're in our own country. We've been here for hundreds of years. I mean, we're part of this society. Nobody's going to hurt us. And some other people said, no, we should leave. And by the time people started getting really frightened, there was nowhere to go. Nobody would take us anyway. And the Hungarians decided to build a ghetto. They took a small part of town, a very dilapidated part, and they made a great big brick wall around it with barbed wire on top. And they started rounding up the Jews. And I remember my father leaving. My father and my mother were holding each other. He had a little suitcase, he had his coat and hat on, and he was holding my mother and they were sobbing. And I kind of wormed my way between them because I had to be part of everything. And I cried too, but I wasn't that worried. I thought Daddy would go on a business trip and come back and bring presents like he always did. And then he left and my mother was distraught. She was sobbing and crying and yelling. And suddenly there was a lot of noise and I ran to the window and I looked out and there were carts and trucks parked all up and down the street. And there were soldiers in green uniforms with black feathers in their hats. And they had guns and whips and they were dragging people out of their houses and herding them onto these vehicles. And people were stumbling and falling and getting kicked. It was very brutal and very cruel. And it was very disturbing. And suddenly everybody was gone. And it was silent, except that they didn't have time to take care of their pets. They had to leave all the dogs and cats behind. There was no time to give them to anyone. There were all these animals running around, hungry animals looking for their masters. So I would run downstairs and try to feed the dogs, try to bring them upstairs. And then my mother stopped me going downstairs because she was hiding me at home. She thought nobody in the ghetto would notice one little girl missing, and she would hide me at home. And I wasn't allowed to go near the windows, I wasn't allowed to go near the doors, I couldn't run because people downstairs would hear my footsteps. And I was utterly miserable until a woman came to see my mother. We used to buy our milk. You see, people didn't buy food in shops like they do now. We would go to the market once a week, and the rest of the time there were people from the countryside coming in their carts, yelling and ringing bells, selling things such as milk and vegetables in the street. And you would come downstairs and buy your food or milk that way. There was a young woman who used to bring our milk. She had a little farm. And she was an orphan, and when my mother found out she was an orphan who was getting married, she gifted her a wedding dress. This was 2 years before the war, and it's that dress that saved my life. My life was saved by a wedding dress, because this young woman didn't forget, and when she heard that they're rounding up the Jews, knowing that my mother married a Jew, came and knocked on her door, and she says, "Where's your little girl?" And my mother says, hiding her. She said, no, give her to me, I'll take her to my farm. She'll be much safer, there's no problems there. I hardly have any neighbors, I'll hide her for you. And my mother handed me over to this woman that she barely knew. I can't imagine how brave she must have been, taking her only spoiled child and handing her over to this woman, hoping that everything would be okay. And I remember being very happy to go with this woman because I was going to be free, and there would be puppies and kittens and children to play with, and I won't be locked up in the house anymore. And I was very happy. I hopped up on her carriage. We had a little wooden bench, and she even let me hold the horse's reins for a while. And off we went for a long time. She was a youngish woman. Her name was Elizabeth. She was very kind. And I remember her as very pretty. She had very, very pretty eyes, very kind face. And she took me to her farm, and when we got to her farm, it was on the side of a hill. Her house was sort of halfway up the hill, and through the gates of the farm to the left was a little barn with 2 stalls, one for the horse and one for the cow, and a little attic above it. And she stopped the cart and got me out, and she says, "You're staying here?" I said, "What do you mean I'm staying here?" She said, "You can't come to my house." I said, "Why can't I stay at your house? I don't want to stay here." She says, "You have to stay here. You can't come to my house. You have to hide in the attic because people want to kill you." I didn't believe her. I mean, you know, when you're less than 5 years old and somebody tells you about somebody trying to kill you, it's so strange. I mean, you know, I'm 84, and if people talk about death, I always think, oh, it's other people die. I don't have time for such things. Death, I mean, death is not a thing that we talk about or think about. None of us think about dying. Everybody in this room is at some point going to die, but do we think about it? No. And for a 5-year-old, it was a total lie. I couldn't believe her. I thought she didn't want me in her house for some reason, and I was crying because she took me up into this little attic, and it was smelly because the animals were underneath, and it was full of hay, and it was getting dark. And there was rustling in the hay, and there were big black spiders everywhere. And I was terrified, and she said, "You have to stay here." And she made me a little bed with some blankets, and she left me. And I remember crying myself to sleep. It got dark, and I was scared, and I was very unhappy. I wanted my daddy, and I wanted my life back, and I hated it. And I cried, and I cried, and I cried myself to sleep. And you know, it's amazing how you can get used to almost anything over time. I was in that attic for 3 whole months, totally alone. She would come 2 or 3 times a day and bring me food. And sometimes she smuggled me up to her house to wash me. But I wasn't allowed to leave that attic. And I got used to being there, and I kept quiet. She told me that if anybody came, I had to be very, very quiet because people want to kill me. You know, I raised 4 sons, and I don't think I managed to keep them quiet for more than 10 minutes, ever. And yet 3 months I was in that attic, totally quiet, and didn't cry and didn't yell. And I didn't believe her, but I was doing what I was told to do. And then one day, very early in the morning, I heard a lot of noise and commotion, and I looked through the cracks of the barn, and I see 3 soldiers, again in those green uniforms with the black feathers, and they're slapping her, and she's bleeding from the mouth and the nose, and she's crying. And they say, "Where's the Jew? We know you're hiding a Jew. Where's the Jew? We want the Jew. Where's the Jew? We have information. You're the Jew. Where's the Jew?" And she says, "There's no Jew. Go and look at my house. There's no Jew." And they ran up to her house, and they ransacked her house, and they were so angry there was nobody there, they started breaking things, and they were throwing dishes through the windows and furniture through the windows and ransacked the house, and they decided to leave. And as they're running towards their vehicle, which was at the bottom of the hill next to the barn, one of them stopped and said, "Wait a minute. How about this barn? Maybe the Jew is in the barn. Let's go." And they started coming up the stairs in their big, black, heavy boots. Now I believed her. And I scooched under the eaves, and I pulled the hay over my head, and I made myself really, really, really small. And I held my breath, and I shut my eyes very tight. Because when you're scared, you shut your eyes, you think it will go away. If you don't see them, they won't see you. And I was trembling and holding my breath, but my heart was beating so loudly, I was afraid they could hear it. It sounded like a drum. And they were getting closer and closer. And suddenly, I hear a step right next to me. And I open one eye and there's a big black boot right next to my head. And the bayonet comes down and it gets stuck in the wood about an inch from my face. And that's when I realized what it means to die. It means that somebody is going to stick a knife in your head. That thing came down and got stuck. And then suddenly the guy pulled it up and they left. Miraculously, they stopped looking. And I remember I wasn't able to move. I was completely paralyzed with fear. And Elizabeth, the name of the lady, she came and she says, "It's all right, they've left. They didn't find you. You don't have to worry. They're not coming back." But I remember I couldn't even stand up for a day or so. I couldn't eat. I could hardly breathe. That's probably when my real beautiful childhood ended. Because going from my wonderful existence, my beautiful childhood to this was a terrible, terrible shock for me. And I then realized what it means to lose everything. And it was never the same again. My poor mother was arrested because people realized that I was on the list and I wasn't in the ghetto. And they tortured her. And she never told us what they did to her. She said it was far too humiliating. But I found out later that the various things that they did to people to try and get them to tell where they hid people or goods, whatever. They were pretty awful. But she never told us what they did to her. She didn't want us to know. And this woman, who was always such a happy, smiling person, became kind of quiet and morose. She did laugh a bit afterwards, but that belly laugh was gone. She lost her sparkle, something happened. And she came and she told us, she was so happy. She said, "The war started and the Russians are coming and they're going to occupy us and they'll be very nice and Daddy will come home and they're not going to kill the Jews and everything will be wonderful. And she's come to take me home." And I remember Elizabeth was crying at the end of her driveway, waving a handkerchief, and my mother was crying, saying goodbye and thanking her. And she took me home to our apartment. I was very happy to go home, but there was nothing to eat, and it was winter, and it was cold, and they were bombing. Every hour there was an air raid, and the sirens went off. It sounded just like the sirens when you hear the news that are happening now in Ukraine. It's exactly the same sound, that sirens were coming, and we had to go down to the cellar and hide there, and then there would be a different sound. Then we could come back up, and it was up and down all day long. Eventually we stopped going into the basement. We just watched the war from the window because there was no point. I mean, the bombs were falling, and hopefully they weren't falling on you. And we were so hungry. There was nothing to eat, and it was cold. We were burning furniture and stuff, but it was still very cold, and we had no electricity, and we had no food at all, and people were starving, and people were trying to find things to eat. I remember looking in drawers, thinking maybe somebody forgot a cookie or a piece of bread. All we could think about is food. Being hungry is not like, hunger is not like when you're a little hungry and you haven't eaten today. It takes complete possession of you. All you can think about is food. You tremble, because you're weak. Your breath smells, your head hurts, your stomach hurts, and all you can think about is food. And I remember looking through the window, and a horse and a carriage went past the house, pulling somebody's pathetic belongings. And the horse dropped right in front of our house. And the guy got out of the cart and starts kicking this horse, but the horse is definitely dead. And he unhitches the cart and takes it away. And within minutes, doors open and people run out with dishes, with knives, and they start skinning this horse. And I remember it was cold, and as they pulled the hide off the horse, there was steam coming out. And we all ate this horse. Within hours, there was nothing left except the hide and a few hoofs and a few guts. Everything was taken away, even the bones. And we all survived because of this one dead horse. And I love horses. I raised 2 horses here in New Hampshire from babies to the age of 29 and 30, I could no more eat a horse now than a person. But when you're hungry, you can eat anything. And that horse was what saved us from starvation. And at this point, the bombing stopped and the Russians started coming across the river. The river, we overlooked the river, which was frozen, and the Russians were coming down one embankment across the frozen river, up on this side, where the people on our side would machine gun them. And they kept coming in waves, holding arms and singing. They must have been drunk, because there's no such bravery, walking into machine gun fire by the dozens. One after the other, they came in waves, singing and dying and singing and dying. Eventually the corpses built up so high you couldn't see the river anymore, and the people on our side stopped shooting, and suddenly we were under Russian occupation. Well, they were not warm and fuzzy like my mother said. They were horrible. They were killing people, they were raping people, they were stealing anything they could get their hands on. They loved wristwatches. You could buy your life with a wristwatch. They would have 5 or 6 on each arm. They obviously didn't have them in Russia then, because that was a big novelty. And I still remember them yelling in Russian, "Давай час," means give me a watch, and "Давай барышня," give me a woman, in that order. First the watch and the woman. And my mother hid a lot of women from our area in our apartment behind some false walls, and they couldn't go out. They were terrified because they didn't want to be hurt by these soldiers. And we were still starving, so my mother decided to take matters into her hand and to go and visit the local commander. But she couldn't go out because she was young and pretty, so she made herself look old. She put on an old grey raggedy dress with a pillow under the dress on her back and a scarf on her head with white chalk in her hair. She blackened her teeth, she drew lines on her face, and she bent double with a cane pretending to be a very old woman. And she walked to the commander. By this time the Russians lost so many people that they were promoting young people to high positions, young people and women. And the commander was a young woman. And my mother, through the interpreter, said to her, "Look, I can make you look very pretty. I'm a dressmaker. I'll make you a dress. Come to my house. That uniform doesn't do it for you. You're a very pretty young woman. Come." And she came, and my mother unhooked the drape from one of the windows that still had one on it, put it on her, and started cutting a dress. And suddenly, the woman was delighted, and she had a pretty dress. My mother even did her hair, and then other Russian women came, and suddenly we had food. They brought us a chicken and bread and even some chocolate, and we were all eating, and we all got very ill. Because when you first eat after having been hungry, you could almost die. It was very difficult because we were all very sick. And it took us about a week to get over the idea that you didn't have to eat everything right then and there. And we started to eat normally, but we still couldn't go out. So my mother went to the commander again and said, "Could we have a guard?" And she said, "Yes, you can have a guard." And she brought us 2 guards. One was a young man called Ivan. He can't have been more than 17. He was a captain. And his sidekick was an elderly gentleman who played the accordion all the time, heavy elderly gentleman. And they were constantly drunk. They came with big bottles of vodka, and then they proceeded to drink my mother's cologne and methylated spirits, anything they could get their hands on. And they were constantly drunk. But they were very nice drunks, you know, there's 2 kinds of drunks. And they talked with Russian dances and Russian songs. And Ivan decided to bring my mother a gift. And the biggest gift you can give a Hungarian housewife is a goose liver. And he brought this goose liver that had a bit of blood on it. He decided to wash it, and he came into the house, and he looked around, and not having come from a home where they had running water, he found the toilet. And he puts the liver in the toilet and washes it. There's still a bit of blood on it. He pulls the chain, the toilet flushes, the liver goes away, he shoots the toilet explodes. I think this is wonderful. My mother doesn't think it's wonderful. But that was Ivan. And then one day I was ill, and Ivan brought me a gift. And I was lying in bed, I had a fever, and he got me this parcel in white paper, and I unwrapped it, and it was beautiful. It was like the rising sun. It was an orange. I had never seen an orange before. We only had fruit that grew where we lived. People didn't import fruit then. And this orange I read about in stories, in fairy stories, and this orange was wonderful. It smelled wonderful, and my mother opened it up and gave me some, and she candied the rest, and I was only allowed to eat it when I was sick, and I wanted to be sick all the time so I could have the orange. To this very day, I always have an orange in my house. And sometimes when I go back to a school, when I've spoken somewhere, they always wait with an orange for me. You have no idea what an orange meant to a child who had been starving. And then the garrison moved out, I'm not sure why, and life started returning to normal until my mother came and said, Daddy's coming home. There are 3 trains coming from the concentration camps. By this time, we heard about the concentration camp, but we didn't believe it. We couldn't believe that such a thing could happen. We thought it was communist propaganda. Because the Germans, who were the most civilized country in Europe, would not allow Hitler to do such a thing. We didn't believe it. We thought it was just, stories. People were panicking, and we thought they were just at the work camp, and they were all coming home. And my mother dressed me, and she dressed herself, and we looked nice, and we went to the railway station, and we stood at the railway station waiting for the train. And the train came, and we stood there holding a picture of my father, saying, have you seen this man? 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 And the train emptied, and there was no Daddy. And we went home crying. My mother was crying, and I was crying. But she was always the optimist. She says, he'll be on the next train. Don't worry, he's not forgetting to come home. And we went back the next day holding up the picture. And the people who came off the train scared me because they didn't look human. They were in rags, and they had no hair, and they had sores, and they smelled bad. And they were not walking, they were shuffling. They were like ghosts. And my mother started collecting these people and bringing them to our house. And she was bathing them, and she's giving her clothes to the women, my father's clothes to the men. And they're telling us these horror stories, and I'm not going to go into that because you all know what happened in the camps. And I heard all this, and I was terrified. I was so frightened that something terrible happened to my daddy. And I didn't know what to think, and I wasn't allowed to hear this, but I hid and I listened. And on the last day, a man came up to my mother and said to her, don't wait for him, he's dead. And she says, what do you mean he's dead? How do you know who I am, and who are you? He says, you don't recognize me? He was a very close friend. But he was in such bad shape that my mother didn't recognize him. And he told us about how he and his family, his wife and his little daughter, who was 11 years old, this is her picture, her name was Dita, when they were deported from the ghetto in my hometown, when they got to Auschwitz, they got them out of the train, and the man was sent to one side, the wife and the child to the other, and they were marched off. And he said to one of the guards, where are they taking them? And the guard pointed to a smoking chimney. At this point, he didn't know what they meant because we didn't believe such things. But they were gassed and burned that very same day. And when I heard this, I was horrified. I started believing that something happened to my daddy. And although I never saw his body, I had to believe that he was dead. And this poor man came and stayed with us because he left everything with their housekeeper, and when he went to see her the next day, she opened the door wearing his wife's dress, saying, oh, well, they didn't kill all of you. Anyway, the Russians took it all, and she slammed the door in his face. And he came back and said to my mother, I have nothing, I have nowhere to go. My mother said, well, stay for a while until you feel better. And he kind of stayed. And he stayed, and slowly out of 2 broken families, we cobbled together a new one. And he married my mother, and he became my stepfather. But he was never my daddy, and I was never Dita, his daughter, because you cannot replace somebody. You can help, but you can't replace. And when this man was dying, I came here to America with me, with my mother and myself. He was dying here in America. He had Alzheimer's, and I was holding his hand on his deathbed, and he kept calling me by his daughter's name. And I was so glad that his mind did not allow him to think that she was dead. And I didn't correct him. I was holding his hand, pretending to be his daughter. I was able to give him that last little comfort in his life. And before he died, he told me how my father died, because he was there. My father and another man from town stole a piece of bread because they were starving, and they were found out. And the commander of the camp decided to make an example of them. So they took the two men and they stripped them naked. It was winter. They beat them, broke all their bones with iron bars, and they put each man in a dog kennel in the middle of this big field where the prisoners had to line up every morning to be counted. And it took my father 2 days and a night to die. And when I heard this, I became completely obsessed with revenge. I became viciously revengeful. All I wanted to do was kill someone. All I could think of is how to hurt people. And it took me 50 years to stop hating. It was a long process. I don't hate anymore. I don't hate, because when your heart is full of hatred, there's no room for anything else. And somehow I managed to get rid of the hatred, and I filled my heart with love. And I'm a very happy person. Believe it or not, people always think, well, how can you be happy and you'll be a survivor? Because I'm a survivor, I'm not a victim. I won. I'm a success. Hitler is dead, I'm alive. Not only am I alive, I have 4 wonderful granddaughters and a new little grandson. And every time I gave birth to one of my sons, I was giving the finger to Hitler. And the little tiny new one, we call him Littlefinger, he was an addendum. And I'm a very happy person, and I have a wonderful multicultural family. I have granddaughters ranging from half African American to half Mexican, half Chinese. I even have one who's half German. One of my sons married a wonderful actress from Canada, and he came to tell me about her, and I was very happy. And he says, well, there's a slight problem. I said, what can there be? Well, her daddy was in the Wehrmacht, in the German army. So I swallowed, and I swallowed again. And I said, no, we don't visit the sins of the father on the children. Neither should you visit the sins of the children on the fathers either. That's just as unfair. And when I held their little daughter in my arms, and I remember the tears just pouring, here's a beautiful child who's a granddaughter of a perpetrator and a victim. And it's perfect, and we must go forward, we cannot go back. And all I can do is just keep loving and going forward and telling everybody to please remember, and don't let it happen, and don't let them take away your history. Don't let them shut you up. Don't let them take books away from you. Don't let them put you in the mindset of hating anybody, because we're all the same. We all want exactly the same thing. And the scapegoating that went on, I remember that it used to be, first it was, it used to be, we were afraid of the Muslims, and then we were afraid of the immigrants, and now we're afraid of the drag queens. Oh yes, they're coming to get us. Really, big danger. Well, let's blame somebody. Now it's very fashionable to be anti-Semitic, and also it's very fashionable to be anti-Muslim, let's hate everybody. I mean, come on. And the point is that these kids today, your generation, God bless your generation, you guys are great because you don't have prejudice. You don't look at people's colors and people's religion. You don't care. As long as they're nice, they're okay, right? You don't care. And please read every banned book. If they ban a book, it's worth reading. It's true. And basically, I just want to is to stand up against bullying and hatred, because after all, Hitler was bullying on steroids, and as you can see, it doesn't start with concentration camps. It starts with little things. It starts with being mean. It starts with speaking ill of someone. Go and talk to that kid that nobody wants to talk to. Do something good in your life if you can. You know, there was this wonderful man, Mr. Ferenc, who died recently. He was one of the prosecutors when the Allies put some of the Nazis on trial in Nuremberg after the war. And he was talking about his father, who was a simple immigrant. He was a shoemaker or something. And he would seat his 2 young children at the table every night, young kids, and say to them, what have you done for humanity today? And they had to do one good thing every day for humanity. Little kids, you know, open a door for someone, feed a dog, give a penny to a beggar, help an old lady across the street. We can all do one good little thing every single day, and that can change your life. And what you guys do now is going to not only affect your lives, but your children's life, and your children's children's life, and you can change the world. And if anybody will, you will have to, because I'm afraid we're not given you a very easy world. You don't have an easy time, but you can do it, you can change it. And I just want to finish with something here that I heard actually on television. It was Churchill, who was Prime Minister of Britain at the time during the bombing in World War II, and he was speaking to the young people. He was saying, hear this, young men and women everywhere. Proclaim it far and wide. The earth is yours and the fullness thereof. Be kind, but be fierce. You are needed now more than ever, for this is your time. Please change the world. Thank you. You can see I have no filter, so you can ask me anything you like. Go ahead. Yes, let's come from there. I moved to New Jersey first, and I hope there's nobody here from New Jersey because I didn't like it. But if you are here from New Jersey, you're here because you didn't like it either. And then I came to New Hampshire, and I'm very happy, and I love it in New Hampshire. I found my home. I live on a mountain. I don't have neighbors. I don't have to love my neighbors. Yeah. Yes.
Is your book banned?
Sorry?
Is your book banned? Is it banned?
No, not yet. I hope it would be, because it would be a bestseller. I would love to have it banned. In fact, I should write one up. Anybody else? Yes.
Do you ever wish that people don't remember you as someone who survived a tragedy or like the Holocaust survivor?
Actually, I've only become a sort of professional Holocaust survivor in my old age. You know, when you're a survivor, you have guilt, and you're very ambitious. I was very ambitious as a young person. I had several very successful careers. I was a journalist, I was a model, I was a fashion designer in London, I ran a theater company. I was so keen on making a mark in the world because I'm alive, you know. And it's only now that I realize, now that finally I know what I want to do when I grow up. This is what I want to do because this is more important. Personal success doesn't matter, this is important. You understand what I mean, right? Yes. My God, what a silent group.
Have you been back, Sandra?
No, I refuse to go back. I want to remember my childhood as the golden childhood, not the blood-soaked childhood, you know. The contrast is too great. I don't want to remember what happened afterwards. And apparently, you know, my hometown had 100,000 people. 30,000 of them were Jews. 300 survived, including me. And you know, there's no memorial, there's nothing. The ghetto where the Jews were incarcerated is now a shopping mall, a pedestrian mall. And the place where my mother was tortured is now derelict. There's not a marker anywhere. People completely forgot these people. It's obscene. There's no, you know, when you lose somebody, you have a grave, you have some kind of memorial. I have nothing. All I have is my memories.
Maybe you do have to go back and make that happen.
Sorry?
Maybe you do have to go back and make that happen.
I'm hoping to get my book translated. I'm trying to do it that way, you know. I want to go this way. Yes, there's somebody back there.
Right here, first. And then we'll go
I'm just curious what your association is now with Judaism, here,
My association with who?
with Judaism, with being Jewish.
With being Jewish? You know, sometimes I think about it. I'm a Jew by persecution, first of all. I'm a Jew because of my father. I'm a Jew because I believe that I have to carry on his legacy, and I want to keep living his legacy. I want to remember those people that were obliterated, the millions of people, you know, who have no plaques, who have no memorialization. I also think that if somebody persecutes you, you automatically have to stand up for them. And I have been persecuted as a Jew, but I don't find, I mean, I've not been persecuted in America, but I'm still very conscious of being Jewish. And in fact, this fashionable anti-Semitism bothers me. It bothers me. It also made me very aware of prejudice of any sort. I will fight for anybody, blue, green, yellow, Muslim, straight, whatever. If somebody's attacked, I will take up the mantle for them, because you cannot allow this to happen to anybody. And you know, I was thinking, I mean, think of Obama. Obama is supposed to be our black president. Obama is as white as I am Catholic. He was put in the black box. He's our black president. I was the Jewish child, although my mother was Catholic. People put you in a box, you see, and that's what you become.
Do you know what happened to the boy with the blonde curly hair?
The little boy was killed. He was killed, yes, unfortunately, and his parents.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm curious, do you have any recommendations for communities who want to come together to make sure we don't forget the past? Ways that you've seen communities come together to kind of keep things on a regular basis in our minds?
Education, 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 education. And I'm very proud of the fact that, you know, in New Hampshire we signed into law that they have to teach genocide and Holocaust studies in all the New Hampshire schools. I pushed that through just before COVID. People said, "How did you manage that?" I said, "I nag better than anyone." That's how you do it. I nag like a Jewish mother.
Up here.
Hi, right here.
Yes.
I'm a Jewish mom of 4 boys, and I'm just so thrilled and grateful to be here tonight and listen to you. But I am wondering about your level of concern, how concerned you are with the anti-Semitism, the rise in anti-Semitism over the last 8 weeks or so.
I'm very concerned, but there's one thing that does cheer me up. America is not tribal like Europe. In Europe, you're either German or Hungarian or Romanian. In America, we're all mixed. I mean, I'm looking around here, there's no two faces that are the same. We're all, when you ask an American, what are you? I'm half Irish, half German, half this, half that. We're so mixed that there won't be one nation against another, because we're all very much part of the mix. I think that's what's going to save us from that type of genocide. I don't think genocide will happen here, but we have to be very aware of it, because it's not just against us. I don't want anyone, I mean, you remember when they started beating up Chinese people when COVID started. I mean, you have to stop people doing things, because it can happen to anybody. One day they might decide to kill people who look like you, because you look like you know. Somebody might find something against you. We have to be very aware of prejudice in all its forms. But these kids know it. These kids know exactly what's going on. Yes?
Have you seen anybody from, have you seen any Holocaust survivors from your town since you've been back in America?
I have actually, believe it or not, when I was in that little kindergarten, there was 52 kids in that kindergarten. 2 of us survived, and I met the other one in London. Many, many years later, I was at a cocktail party in London, and I heard a woman speaking who sounded like me. And I walked up to her and I said, "Who are you?" And it turned out she was the other girl from my kindergarten who survived. And we fell on each other crying and screaming and yelling, and there were all these upper-class English people looking down their noses at us, but we didn't care. Oh, it was a wonderful, wonderful thing. It was such a wonderful thing to have met her. But that's the only one from my hometown whom I know. And of course my stepfather.
Not exactly a question, but I just want to say that my father's family is of Jewish descent. They come from Germany and Austria in that region, and we have, no record of their family or what happened to them when they were over there. But I'm not Jewish. My dad doesn't feel like he's Jewish, but I really resonate when you're like, I'm Jewish by persecution and not by religion. So I just want to say.
I know exactly what you mean, because it's more than a religion. I mean, you can become anything if you take up another religion, but you cannot become Jewish or get rid of your Jewishness, because it's there.
Do you know what happened to the woman who kept you in the barn?
Sorry? The woman who kept me alive, Elizabeth, we supported her until she died. She died of cancer a few years after the war, unfortunately. But she's my hero. That woman saved me and my whole family, and my grandchildren and their children, the whole generation. One good deed.
How early of an age do you think children should start learning about prejudice?
Well, I was asked to go and speak to a magnet school to 4th graders. And I decided at the time to make it a bit easier, because I was a bit apprehensive to tell them horror stories. So I decided to talk about some frogs in my daughter-in-law's pond, and how one of the frogs has 6 legs, and how the 6-legged frog was persecuted. And then I said, and I was like a 6-legged frog. I was persecuted because I was different from the other kids. I went home and I got a letter from a kid saying, "Thank you for teaching us about Jewish frogs." So 4th grade is not. So I think 6th grade and up really is appropriate. And again, you guys know more than the generation before you because of the internet. You have access to far more information. And just be careful what information you get, and don't go down the rabbit hole. Some of those, the information that you can get online is unbelievable. About people eating children, and somebody in a what is it now? It's a pizza parlor in Washington, where in the basement they eat children. Well, there's no basement in that pizza parlor, but never mind. So just be careful about the information.
So what would you say to state educators that are insisting that Holocaust education start in 10th grade?
If that's okay, if that's what they want to do, I have no problem. I mean, in New Hampshire, there is no mandate when they have to teach it, as long as they teach it before they graduate high school. Some people teach it earlier, some people teach it later. I think every school should do whatever they feel their children are ready for. I don't have a criteria for age. I just know that too young doesn't really work, because you don't want to scare them.
Now that you're older more and understand it more, do you wish that you were older than 5 and understood it more at the time?
Yes. Yes, I do. I do. But on the other hand, if I was older, I probably wouldn't be as happy as I am now. I would be much sadder. You know, I think having had it happen to me young, I was able to grow out of the pain. You see, I'm a happy person.
Hi, over here.
Yeah.
I was wondering if there were any pieces of media that you recommend, books, or you said you had a theater company, plays, or anything that you would recommend reading to further our education and understanding?
Well, first of all, you know, obviously Anne Frank is a wonderful book. There are other books. There's quite a lot of literature now, Holocaust literature. There was a wonderful book called The Book Thief. That's a wonderful book. If you just go online, or go online for the Keene State, they have a Holocaust education department. What's it called now? The Cohen Center in Keene State. They will give you a list of books. And also, everything is free. The whole point is, it's not a mandate that you have to pay for. All the education stuff for genocide and Holocaust studies is free. And what we did in New Hampshire is not just Holocaust, it's also genocide. Because there are other genocides going on now, and there have been genocides. I would like to have somebody teach about a Native American genocide that happened. That's completely ignored as well. And we should revive that. You know, once this becomes sort of habit, maybe we can expand it, because there's so much else that was wrong that we should try and not repeat. Because those poor people have no written testimony, it's all word of mouth. And I'm hoping that they don't get forgotten.
We have another one.
How do you think schools could protect their Jewish students from their recent rise in anti-Semitism and make a safe community?
I don't understand the question.
Sorry. How do you think schools could protect their Jewish students from the recent rise in anti-Semitism and make a safe community?
By informing everybody. Education, again, talk about it, be very open. Be very open and discuss it, because not talking about it doesn't make it go away. Make people aware, and you know, talk to the kids and explain to them, because most of them understand very well. I mean, people aren't born hating, they get taught hatred.
You talked about how it took you 50 years to let go of your hatred and the desire for revenge.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you did that?
Believe it or not, there was one specific thing that happened to me. I was walking home from school, I was about 8. I had 2 long braids, and I was a little, I think I was an obnoxious kid, because I always knew the answers and I was showing off. And one of the kids cut off one of my braids, and I was walking home with my braid in my hand, crying. And a man stopped me. I've never met the man before or after, an old man, and he told me, "Little girl, stop crying, go home, cut off the other braid. It will look very nice and your hair will grow back. But if you let them make you sad, and if you hate them, you are going to be a very unhappy person. You have to love them. That really makes them upset." And for some reason, that was almost like a switch. If I would believe in angels, I would have said it's an angel. It was just an old man, but who knows? But it was almost like a switch. And I thought, well, yeah, I'm not going to be a victim. I went home and I cut off my other braid.
We can take about 2 more questions. And if there are more questions, just raise your hand. There will be a documentary of Kati's life, is coming out next year, and it will be entitled Hidden, just as her book is entitled Hidden. Any other questions?
What was the worst year for you when you were hiding?
What was the what?
Worst year for you when you were hiding?
I was only hiding.
When you were hiding, what was the worst part of the
worst
year?
part, I think the worst part was, well, at first it was the spiders until I became friends with them. Because they were not bad spiders, they were just ugly. And I caught one, and I put a string on his leg, and he became my pet. And then the leg came off. But the worst part was the bayonet, when the guy came with the bayonet. That was the worst memory that I have of my whole life. That was the scariest. After that, nothing scares me. I think, oh, there's another, okay.
Are you still like traumatized by the bayonet sticking right in front of your head?
Not anymore. I tell you why. Because when I speak, it's almost like therapy. I speak to people like you, and I get so much love back. It's almost like being hugged. My soul is hugged. Every time I speak to people like you, I get so much love back. It's wonderful. I've yet to meet a nasty person. I even went to the local prison in my state because I wanted to meet a Nazi, and I wanted to try and talk to him and see why he hates me. And I went and I asked these people who are incarcerated, 80 of them, and I said, any of you want to tell me why you hate me, please come and talk to me privately. But it was a love fest. It was so disappointing. I wanted to take them all home to dinner. I've yet to meet somebody who wants to talk to me about hatred. Nobody wants to tell me they hate me, and I'm waiting. I know it's there. They tried to kill me, but maybe not in America. Thank you. I think we're done. Thank you very much.